Hey, this is Tom from ELPHNT. I'm here at DBS Music Bristol. I'm an Ableton certified trainer, and for my workshop today, I'm going to be talking about sparking your creativity and generating ideas in Ableton Live. Cool, hello everyone, thanks for having me. So what we're going to be looking at today is how you can use Ableton and use some things in Ableton to help you generate ideas when you get stuck. So no matter how competent a musician you are, everyone sort of runs into a situation where you might be stuck for an idea, you can't come up with something, you're not really feeling inspired. So there's a set of tools that we can use to help us get out of those creative blocks. And even if you are maybe not as accomplished a musician, and we're going to look at some cool stuff in the second half about becoming a more accomplished musician, which is going to be exciting. But even if you're not, you can use some of these tools to help generate some musical material as well. So let's get started. So I've got a sound loaded up here. Usually how you would approach creating a part, I'm going to start with a chord pattern, is you might have a chord pattern in your head, you're going to play it in. We're not going to do that. I'm not going to play anything in today. I'm going to let Live generate some chord patterns for me. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new MIDI track. And what you'll notice is that in Live, if I've got a MIDI track that has an instrument on it, so this first track that I had, it's got an instrument on it, it sends audio out of its output. So it's sending audio out that track. But if you have a MIDI track that doesn't have an instrument on it, so this is just a blank MIDI track, it still sends MIDI out of its output. And we can do some really interesting stuff with this. So you can take that MIDI and you can send it to the input of any other track in Live. So I can send that MIDI from this track to the input of the first track here. And now if I arm this track, set the monitor of this track to in, I can now play notes on this track. So I can play some notes on this track, and they send their MIDI information to the first track, plays the notes. Not particularly amazing. I could have done that just by playing some notes on this track, but we're going to get to the interesting part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a MIDI clip on this track and just plug in a note. Doesn't matter what notes at this stage. Click play on that clip. So as I'm sure you're familiar if you have worked with Ableton Live before, this is just going to keep looping around and triggering that note. I'm going to create another MIDI track and create a clip again, and also set this to output to that same track. So you can have multiple MIDI tracks sending all their MIDI to a single other track, and it's going to combine all that data. So on the second clip here, I'm going to plug in another note somewhere else and hit play on that clip. So now both my notes are sending, and I'm starting to get a rhythm out of that. Again, this is not particularly interesting, but what I can start to do is if I go into the second clip, by default, my clip is going to be a bar long. And at the moment, both of these clips are both a bar long. So they're looping in sync with one another. But if I take the second clip, I can make it 3 beats and 3.5 beats long. So now it's going to be out of sync with that first beat long loop. So if we listen to what's going to start happening, so notice how the rhythm changes every time it loops around. It's a different rhythm. So essentially we've created a polyrhythm. I'm sure you've all heard of polyrhythms before. We've got multiple different rhythms on top of one another. So let's go one step further. I'm just going to duplicate this last track, and let's move this note somewhere else and set a completely different length loop. So now we've actually got 3 polyrhythms going. So we're going to get this really interesting kind of generative rhythm that's going to take a very long time to actually repeat the rhythm. Again, this is still not necessarily that interesting. So next what I'm going to do is create another MIDI track, and I'm going to stick this MIDI track in between all these 3 MIDI tracks here and my synth, and I'm going to call this my MIDI bus. And I'll take the output of all 3 of these MIDI tracks. I'll set their output to the MIDI bus, set the MIDI bus to go to my synth sound, and the monitor to in. So the MIDI is going from these 3 tracks into this one track, then this track's going to the synth. So it should be exactly the same as what we had before. So here's where we start to get a little bit interesting. I'm sure many of you know Live has got a number of built-in MIDI effects. So you use MIDI effects for processing MIDI data. They take incoming MIDI data and transform it into various different things depending on the MIDI effect that you use. So we can take this MIDI data that's coming into this track and transform it in some interesting ways. So the first thing we're going to use is the random device. I'll drop it on the MIDI bus. So that's sort of the reason for creating this MIDI bus, is it gives me a place that I can put all these MIDI effects to process the signal. So the way this random device works is any MIDI note that comes through here is going to have its pitch randomized. And the chance that any of that randomization is going to occur is controlled by this chance control. So at 0% chance, no randomization is going to occur. At 100% chance, every single note that passes through there is going to have its pitch randomized. So we've got this kind of generative rhythm happening. We've got a bunch of random notes. Let's take the chord MIDI device. I'm going to drop it after the random MIDI device. So these MIDI effects are stackable. The effects are just going to combine as you add more of them. The chord MIDI device takes incoming MIDI notes and creates a chord by adding or creating notes at certain intervals that you specify. So I can plug in just whatever intervals. So it's generating some chords now. They're not particularly musical chords. Again, I've just got these kind of random notes here, so it might work if you're making some kind of dissonant horror film score or something, or some atonal music. But most of the time we want something that's going to be in a particular musical key. So we can use the scale MIDI device. The scale MIDI device is best to use some of the presets. So most of the MIDI devices are pretty easy to set up and configure from scratch, but the scale one's a little bit more complicated, so we'll use one of the presets. What the scale device does is it takes any MIDI notes that pass through there and maps it to a predefined key. So let's go with C minor. So now what you'll hear is that our chords that we're generating are going to sound a lot more musical. We could transpose these down an octave if we want. Now the best part about this whole thing is that this track here, our synth track that's playing the sounds, it just sees all of this MIDI data as regular MIDI data, as if you were playing it in from a keyboard. It doesn't know that there's all these MIDI effects happening, that there's all this, these sort of trigger tracks over here. So I can arm the record on this track and record a clip in here, and it's just going to record all those notes. So I'm just going to let this record for a while. Cool, so that'll be good. So we've got still got a semi-generative rhythm going on. We've got these sort of random chords being created. But again, it's still quite random. There's not a lot of repetition to it. Most of the time when you're making music, you want some kind of repetition if you have a chord pattern. So that was the reason I let it record for quite a while, because what we can do now is go into this clip that we've recorded and just set a shorter loop length, maybe even go 2 bars. And we're going to start to get more kind of musical chord progressions coming out of this. Oh, I just need to turn the monitor back to auto. So there's a chord progression. And what we can do inside a clip in live is, if we've got a loop set up here, we can click the loop selector and just press the up and down arrows to jump it by its own length. Or you can use the left and right arrows to sort of shift it around and just choose different sections from these notes that we've recorded. So it's kind of a cool chord progression. And obviously the longer you record, the more ideas you're going to have to work with. You can go away, make a cup of tea, come back. You're going to have just endless chords to pick and choose from. And again, all of this is just MIDI data. It's recorded in as MIDI. So we can adjust the timings of these. We can adjust the notes, change up some of the chords, grab different chords from elsewhere if we want. The idea is that it's just creating material for you, and you can then sort of be more of a curator and listen for the parts that you like. So often what I'll do in this sort of setup is I'll keep a master clip up at the top here. I'll just duplicate that, play this new one, and crop the selection that I've made. So I can always go back to my master clip that's got all of these chords in and get some new chords if I want. Cool. So we got some chords. You can sort of repurpose the same technique to generate melodies and bass lines as well. So let's load up a bass sound. I'll just find, let's go with this one. And let's put the bass next to the chords. I'll just label these so we can keep track of what everything is. All we need to do now is take the output of this MIDI bus, which is sending that MIDI data, and instead of sending it to the chords, we'll just send it to the bass. Let's maybe stop the bass. I'll put all of these in a group as well, so I can very easily start and stop them. So that's my MIDI. So that's sending to the bass. A couple things I want to do to sort of repurpose this. I'll probably want to turn off the chords, because if I'm wanting to generate a melody or bass line, I want single notes. You can actually hear that this particular bass sound I've loaded up is monophonic anyway, so it's only playing one note at a time. So I'll turn the chords off. Then, depending on whether I'm going for a melody or a bass line, I also might want to just transpose my MIDI notes. So I can do that straight from the scale device here. So that's kind of more of a melody, but if I go down, even further, you're going to start to get a bass line. You can do the same thing. I'm not going to record it in now, but record a clip, just let it run, and you're going to generate some melodies and bass lines that you can work with. So you can do a similar thing for drums as well to create rhythmic patterns. So it's a little bit different for drums. So I'm going to load up a drum instrument and show you how to set this up. So I'll create a new MIDI track again, and let's just make this my kick drum. But I'm going to set this to output to the drums track. So it's going to send its MIDI to the drums, and I'll create a clip. What's quite cool about this, I was quite impressed when I found this out, is that even though this clip is on a totally separate track, those of you who use drum racks in live, you'll know that when you use a drum rack, it shows up the names of the samples that you got in those notepads. So even though the drum rack's on this track and the MIDI clip's on this track, because it's sending its MIDI to that input, it still picks up those names, which is pretty handy. So I can go in here and program in a kick pattern. In fact, let's just go into draw mode. And that should, cool, send itself to my drums. Let's go with a hi-hat. Just stop that while I get a hi-hat going. I'm just going to kind of draw in whatever pattern for now. Now, again, remember the key is always to set the other loops, alternating loops, to odd lengths. So kind of whatever, really. And if I trigger this hi-hat now, you can hear it's kind of got a polyrhythmic feel to it. With drums, it's quite important to have at least sort of one element that keeps in the regular one bar so that you kind of keep that time. So the kick can be quite nice. The kick and the snare, keeping a one bar pattern can kind of hold that down. But even the snare, we can plug in a snare here and have it have a sort of unsynced pattern. So let's send this snare. I'm just going to throw in some snare drums over here, and let's do a three beat pattern. And then again, I can just record this in. Let it run for a little while. And again, same thing, go in here and I can just select so these are patterns that I never would have played myself. Cool, so there's a drum pattern that I've generated for myself. What you'll discover if you explore this is you can kind of have some sort of control over the rhythm that's generated based on how you program in these clips. If you want the rhythm to have a 16th feel, obviously you can program the notes to fall on 16th notes. If you want it to have an 8th note feel, you can program that in those trigger clips. but working with those polyrhythms will give you some kind of interesting generative results. So I'm just going to group those to keep them out the way. That's my drum triggers. So there's a couple things that we can do to generate musical material, and we could generate just endless amounts of musical material with that. But something else that we often might want to do in electronic music in particular is to adjust the sound, the actual tonal quality of what we're using, and keep that a little bit more interesting as well. And there's a number of different applications for this. And we can apply the same sort of thinking to how we work with the sound. I think for me, one of the problems that I often run into with electronic production is it can get quite static and stale. So even though this drum beat now is quite an interesting beat, the sounds are exactly the same, the velocities are exactly the same, it doesn't have a lot of life to it, it's just going to keep looping and get kind of boring. So there's a MIDI effect that we can use for that as well. If you go over to the MIDI effects, there's the velocity MIDI effect. So I'll drop that before my drums. I just need to make sure that this drum kit actually has some velocity sensitivity. So you obviously need to make sure that whatever instrument you're working with is going to respond to velocity. Now, in this velocity MIDI device, there's a lot of things that you can do to shape the velocity of the MIDI notes that pass through it. But the one I'm most interested in is this random control here. So you'll see as we go through the rest of this talk, randomness is the kind of main concept that keeps coming up, is using randomness and kind of embracing randomness, but a controlled randomness to generate interesting parts. So if I dial this all the way up, what you'll hear is that every note that goes through this drum kit now is going to have a randomized velocity. So it's kind of all over the place at the moment. But with a lot of these things, you kind of just want to be a little bit subtle. So I might set that to like 15. And it's going to make sure that all the notes that pass through there are all just going to be slightly different, a little bit more like a real drummer might play them. It's got a little bit more life to it now in terms of the velocity of it. But so let's look at the sound itself and how we can actually transform the sound of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move these hi-hat notes to this open hi-hat sound, and you'll see why in a moment. Cool, so with this open hi-hat, I've got this decay control that I can adjust. So if I do that from the push. Again, sort of thinking about a real drummer, if a real drummer is playing on a hi-hat, they might have some slightly more open, some slightly more closed to get different kind of tones out of it. So we can control this in our clip. I'm just going to crop this clip to a bar long. So any parameter that you have in a device in Live, if you're working in the session view, you can right-click and say Show Automation, and it's going to take you to the clip automation for the track. So I can just draw in here. Let's turn the grid off. And I can just draw in some automation. Cool. Cool, so that's changing over time. But by default, the automation is going to loop with the clip. So again, it's not going to sort of change over time. It's just going to stay the same. But we can set up polyrhythms with our automation as well. So in the envelope section of the clips down here, you'll notice there's this button here that says Loop Linked. By default, the loop of an automation is going to be linked with the loop of the clip. But if I click that, you'll notice that the notes have disappeared, so they're still here. I can flip back over to the note view. But the envelope actually has its own loop length now, an independent loop length, independent of the length of the MIDI. So let's make this a little bit longer. Let's make this 1 beat and, well, 1 bar and 2 beats long, and just add in some extra automation here, whatever that happens to be. So you can hear the pattern of that hi-hat opening and closing is out of sync with the main loop. So that sound's going to kind of change and evolve over time. So let's do something else. This particular drum rack that I've got set up, there is this control for sample select. So I can change the actual sample that's being used. So that could be a kind of a fun one to use for this. So again, I'm going to right click on that and say show automation. And just straight away, I'm going to unlink the loop of that. So every single automation lane that you have for each control that you automate in each individual clip can have its own loop length. So you can have just an unlimited amount of these polyrhythms running with the sound. So let's make this, I don't know, 2 bars and 1 beat long. And I'm actually going to use something in, I don't know if anyone's seen the new live 10.1 beta that was announced. There's some new features in that. One of the really cool new features, that's probably my favorite new feature, is the ability to draw in automation shapes. So I can select the length of time, right click and say insert shape. It's pretty awesome. It gets better because I can select that automation shape and I can transform it, which is pretty fun. Just hang on a moment, because then I do this, and then you can kind of flip it upside down and do some weird. It's good fun, but I digress. I just wanted to show that off because it's fun. So I've drawn in some automation there. This is for now the actual sample changing itself. And again, unsynced loop, so it's going to just keep kind of evolving and changing over time. And my hi-hat's kind of pretty interesting. Let's do it for one more element. Let's maybe go onto the, why not do it on the snare drum? Let's do it for the sample selector of the snare drum as well. I'm just kind of going a bit crazy here with this, just to sort of show what's possible. But usually if you're working with this, you might be doing it to 1 or 2 elements. Being a little bit more subtle as well can work quite well. Let's set this to 1 bar and 1 beat long. And in fact, I'm going to record in some automation for this. So on the clip there. Cool. Recorded that in mostly because I just want to show you another new feature as well. If I select all of this automation, you'll notice I've got a whole bunch of dots here. You can now right-click that and say simplify envelope, which is pretty handy. Lots of long-time Ableton users in the house, it sounds like. So let's listen to what's happening with that snare drum. So it's a pretty interesting loop. It's maybe gone a bit too far, but you get the idea. So we can use this polyrhythmic idea with our sounds as well. We could even do it with a synth sound. If I go over to this synth over here, that parameter has some nice effect on the sound. So let's just go to the automation there, unlink it. So once you get the hang of it, you can get going pretty quickly and just draw in some automation. And that sound, again, is just not going to loop with the clip, so it's going to keep it interesting. So you can do that with any aspect of the sound in a clip. So let's move on to something slightly different that we can use and that I often use to help sort of give me some kind of inspiration when I'm making music. And that is working with field recordings. So just a quick show of hands. Anyone here working with field recordings in their music? Nice. It's good. Good number of people. For those of you who aren't, you should really get onto that. So field recordings essentially is just a recording that you've done in the field as opposed to in the studio. It used to be quite an inaccessible sort of art because you'd have to have some expensive gear. Now everybody has a field recorder in their pockets and they're really good. So there's no excuse not to do it. You can get some really interesting sounds out of it. So just go out and record weird sounds. I noticed there was a building site across the road. There'd be some pretty interesting sounds coming from there. So this was a recording that I did in my kitchen just with this iPhone. Let's just have a listen to what some of the sounds are like. Cool, so there's lots of interesting material in there. There's some sort of tonal sounds in there. There's some more rhythmic sounds. So let's look at how we can use these to generate some interesting material. I'll drop this in live. So probably the easiest thing to do with field recordings is to generate rhythmic material with them. Inside, you would have heard there's kind of a bit of rhythmic material happening over here. If I jump to that section of the loop. Even near the end here. So I could just simply grab that and actually use it as an interesting kind of loop if I wanted to. What I'm going to do though is use Live's simpler instrument. Is everybody familiar with the simpler? Lots of heads nodding. Cool. Really powerful little instrument, the simpler. And I'm just going to drop this sample straight in there. And I'm going to use the slicing mode in the simpler. So the slicing mode takes the sound and slices it up based on the transients in the audio file. So the transients are sort of short spikes in volume. So these things over here would be a transient. So it's sliced it up based on the transients in the file. So each one of these now essentially becomes a note on my keyboard. It's a little bit much over here. It's a bit kind of bunched up, so you can dial down the sensitivity to pick up slightly less of the transients. Cool, so I got lots of nice, interesting, tricky, rhythmic things happening. There's a nice snare in there somewhere. That could be kind of interesting. But what I find when working with field recordings is the actual nature of the sound itself just tends to push you in a certain direction. So these are all very kind of like little extra percussion bits that I could use to go along with my drums. I could maybe transform these to make them more like an interesting sounding drum kit. But in this case, I've already got a drum beat, so I'm just going to program in an interesting rhythm to go alongside my drum pattern. So let's plug some stuff in here and just throw in a bunch of notes. It's kind of an interesting one. So you can hear that that field recording is adding some kind of really interesting textural element to that drum pattern. I mean, the drum pattern itself is a bit wild with that changing snare, so it's a bit difficult to hear it against that. But field recordings can be a really interesting way to add texture to the sound and make it sound a little bit less digital as well. There's another thing that we can do with field recordings, which can be quite fun, is actually turn them into synth sounds as well. So rhythmically, they're quite easy to work with. You can just throw it in the simpler and chop it up and work with it that way. But turning it into a synth sound is a little bit more difficult. So let's listen to this recording again. Immediately you can hear there's definitely something tonal in there. If I jump ahead a bit, there's quite a nice sort of tonal section. So let me just select that. Cool. So the first thing I want to do is bring out that tonal element of the sound. So there's a bit of noise in there, but there's a little bit of tone. So let's bring that out. So I'm going to use, if I go into my audio effects, I'm going to use the EQ8. So just Live's EQ. You could use any EQ really. But what that's going to allow me to do is let me isolate certain frequencies. So if I look at this recording, I can actually already see there that there's one sort of frequency sticking out, and that's probably that resonant frequency that I'm hearing as that note. So I'm going to grab an EQ band, just boost around there, bring out that resonance. There's a handy trick you can use in the EQ8 when you're doing things like this is if you click this little headphone icon, anytime you grab an EQ band, it solos what's under that band. So you just hear the frequencies being affected by that band, so you can really easily find where that resonance is. Just really bring that out. Cool. So the next thing I want to do is I want to actually write this EQ to an audio file. I'm going to ultimately take this sort of resonant sound, I'm going to drop it in a sampler so that I can play it like an instrument. But if I drop the sample into the sampler now, it's not going to take the EQ with it. So I just need to write it to the audio file. To do that, I can just right-click, say, Freeze Track, and then right-click again and flatten it. So that's now part of that audio file. That resonance has been written to it. So again, I'll load up a simpler and drag and drop this sound in there. And what we should hear, oh, if I unsolo this track, really interesting kind of synth sound. What I really like about these is you'll notice that it even gets the sort of rhythmical, textural elements of the sound. So a little clicky bit at the beginning. So that's kind of a really interesting synth sound that I would have never created if I was building it from scratch with a synthesizer. And it's also a unique synth sound. Nobody else has got that synth sound because it's come from my kitchen. There's a couple things that you need to consider though if you do end up using this, is my kitchen is not trying to be in any particular key. So it's not tuned at all. So the first thing I need to do with this sound is actually tune it. So I'm going to grab Ableton's tuner. So I'm playing the note of C. It's giving me kind of somewhere between a C and a B. So let's go and just tune this up a bit. Cool. So that should be a C. You can always just play other notes and check. It should be an E. Cool. So it should be in tune. Now I can take this sound and I can use all of these synthesis tools in the simpler and transform it even further. If I want to filter it, maybe I want to add some modulation to that filter, whatever I want to do. But I can work with that sample as the source of the sound. So I'm going to make this maybe more of a kind of a plucky sound. And I'm actually going to replace that sound that I had in the beginning. So let's just move this over to this track. Cool, that's kind of an interesting sound. Got a little bit of texture to it. Okay. So we've got some kind of generative stuff happening with our sound. We've got some generative stuff happening with our chords and melody. Let's go a little bit further with the sound. There's a lot of parts of the native effects that are built into Ableton that can help you with this. One thing that I like to use quite a lot with my sounds is, you'll find this on many of the synthesizers in live and the samplers, is these pan via random controls. Again, anywhere you see random, there's some fun stuff to be had there. So what this does is it randomizes the panning. Hopefully we're in stereo in this room. I'm going to turn that up, and what we should hear, that speaker's hidden behind a screen, so we might not hear that. But rest assured, those notes are panning randomly, and the way it works is that every time it plays a new note, it will adjust the panning randomly, so you get these notes appearing in different spaces in the stereo field. So there's lots of these elements that you can apply to the sound to add a bit less, well, take away some of the staticness of the electronic sounds and make them feel a little bit more alive. So I'm going to hop over to another session to look at another thing that we can do. So the other kind of major element of production, we've also got writing and sound here, songwriting and sound, but a big element of production is arrangements and actually arranging songs. And we can use this idea of randomization with our arrangements as well. So this is a little bit more complicated, so just bear with me for a second while I explain it. I've got a couple of clips here, and these have just coincidentally all been generated using some of those techniques that we looked at. I'll just play you an example of what this sounds like. So you can hear we've got the random sounds happening in the drums. Got some kitchen percussion, all the things that we've been looking at. So there's a function in Live called follow actions. And follow actions give you a way to automatically trigger things in the session view, or have things automatically trigger themselves, essentially. If I double click on a clip in the session view and I head down to the bottom left where there's this little L, that hides and shows the launch box if it's not visible already. So this is the launch box over here. And right at the bottom of the launch box is this section called follow actions. So there's 3 elements to a follow action and how a follow action works. The first element is the length of time before the follow action occurs in bars, beats, and divisions. So 4 bars, 0 beats, 0 divisions. So after 4 beats, whatever the follow action is doing, after 4 bars, whatever the follow action is doing is going to happen. The next 2 elements tell us what is going to happen. And you can have 2 options here and have it choose between the 2. I'll explain how that works now. But the options we have are no action, which is the default on any new clip that you create, which is why you don't just have this happening all the time in Ableton, because all clips default to no action. You can have stop, where the clip will stop playing. So let's actually look at what that looks like. Let's see what that looks like. So with this follow action setup, the clip's going to play for 4 bars and then stop. So I've got my drum clip here. So I did nothing there. The clip just automatically stopped by itself after the 4 bars because of the follow action. So some other things that we've got here, the clip can play again, restart itself. The next couple ones deal with the concept of clip groups, which is quite easy to understand. In a track in the session view, a clip group is any number of clips that are directly next to one another. So these 2 clips here at the moment are 2 separate clip groups because they're not directly next to one another. If I move them like that, they're now part of a clip group because they're directly next to one another. If I had another clip over here, I've got 2 clip groups. These 2 clips here are in one clip group. This is in a different clip group. So the next few options in the follow actions refer to these clip groups. So previous, it's going to play for however long, and then play the previous clip in the group, or the clip above the one that's currently playing. Next, it'll play the one below. First, it's going to jump to the first one in the group if there's lots of clips. Last will be the last. And then any and other are random options. So it's going to jump to any random clip in the group. So we can have 2 of these actions set up. And the bottom element of the follow action defines the chance that either one is going to occur. So in a ratio. So at the moment where it's 1 to 0, there's a 1 to nothing chance that this follow action is going to occur and this one's not. So there's a 100% chance that this clip is going to stop. If I were to set this to 1 to 1, there's a 50-50 chance that either the clip's going to stop or the clip's going to play again. I'm just going to set this back to what it was, which is next. So if we look at this clip now, there's a 50-50 chance that either it's going to play the next clip below it or it's going to play itself again. So let's actually have a look at that and see what happens. So if I play this drum beat, in theory, after 4 bars, either it's going to play again or it's going to jump to the clip below. And it's completely random, so it might take a while to happen. Cool, so it's jumped down to playing that clip. You can always tell when a follow action is going to occur because the clip that's about to be triggered will have its button flashing. So that's follow actions. Let's get back to how this is actually going to help us with arrangements. So what I've got set up here is, just for demonstration's sake, this is actually a blank clip. There's nothing in there. It's just 4 bars of absolutely nothing. And this is our drum beat. This second clip has almost the opposite follow action. It's going to play for 4 bars, and then either it'll play itself again, there's a 50-50 chance that it's going to play itself again, or it's going to jump back to the previous clip, which is the drums. So either of these clips is going to play for 4 bars, then either play the next clip, and so on and so forth. The same goes for all of these clips over here. So I'm just going to move these back so everything's in the same clip group. So what you'll see will happen if I trigger all of these clips, every 4 bars, either they're going to keep playing again, or it's going to jump down to one of these blank clips and play nothing. So what you'll notice starts to happen is my track is almost arranging itself on the fly every 4 bars. Something new is happening. I'm not touching anything at this stage. It's just doing its own thing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But what we can do now is anything we do in the session view, we can record into the arrangement view. So double click stop, set it back to the beginning, on my record, and I'm just going to play. I'll jump to all the silent clips, so that doesn't help. Let's just start it from the top again. And so all of that's going to get recorded into the arrangement. And it's just going to build this arrangement for me. So that was kind of an interesting change that I might not have done just if I was doing this by myself. That one, on the other hand, probably not. But again, with this technique, it's just recording these things into the arrangement view, so I can go in and I didn't really like that change, I can just delete it. And I really liked that change over here, so I might want to use that again. But the whole idea of this is going to do things that you might not do yourself and give you inspiration. And bearing in mind that this is just with 5 clips. If you've got a session view with a whole number of different variations, you're going to get some really interesting results out of that. So the idea behind any of these techniques is that they just sort of help you along the way when you get stuck, or if you just want to try something interesting. You could even make an entire song that is just completely generated randomly if you wanted to, if you were into that sort of thing. Thanks for having me. So that was my masterclass on generating ideas and sparking your creativity in Ableton Live. Thanks for watching.